So I want to ask a hypothetical question. Say you're in favor of Congressman Apple or candidate Apple, and they're about to win by maybe 50 percentage points. Are you likely to donate to their campaign? Well, you probably wouldn't because they're likely to win anyways, whether you donate money or not. So people don't always give money because they love specific candidates. They give because the situation has suddenly become worrisome. And in fact, what I'd like to suggest here is people are most likely to give money not because they like a particular candidate, but because they hate the competition. So say you don't even care about candidate Apple, but candidate Peach you hate. You know that if they come into office, your business may go out of business, or they may pass legislation that'll make your life much more difficult. I would suggest that this is the fundamental way that donating to a campaign happens. So here we've got candidate Peach, who we hate, so we end up donating money to candidate Apple. The unfortunate thing here is we don't even have a name for this type of contribution, and I would like to give it a name, so let's call it Brubery. And I'd like to propose that this concept of Brubery is very, very important, because in the United States, we've got this obsessive idea that bribery is what causes all the corruption. And I've already suggested that intimidation might be a greater force than bribery, indeed a much greater force than bribery. And now I'm suggesting that we've got this other thing called Brubery. And if you think about it, Brubery is a little bit in the middle, right? It's a little bit like a threat. You're willing to give money to Congressman Apple so you can get rid of Congressman Peach. But it's not intimidation in the sense that you never make that threat explicit. And I'd like to suggest that Brubery might even be more powerful than bribery. And certainly the combination of Brubery and intimidation start to answer a number of puzzles that we see in the data. So here's Joshua Taubman, or whatever his name is, who is suggesting that transparency can't be an issue because we don't see any of the money being donated correlating with specific votes. So what he's suggesting is we don't see really strong links between cash going in and changes in legislation. And so what he's really suggesting here is we don't really see evidence of bribery. But what if bribery isn't the main way to change legislation? As I'll suggest in another video, you can take $75,000 using intimidation and change national legislation on major issues for 10, 20, even 100 years for $75K. Try and do that with bribery. Bribery is much more expensive than intimidation. And bribery in its purest form is illegal, and even through campaign finance, etc. It's kind of a tough thing, right? That's stuff people are always trying to snoop out. But intimidation, well, you can do that publicly. You can take out negative ad campaigns about a congressman, as much money as you want to spend on that, and it will never be limited because of the First Amendment. And then you have Brubery, which is people chucking lots of cash into a system and not asking the candidate to change their votes at all. They're so afraid of Congressman Peach that they just go with candidate Apple. And a lot of times I would suggest that candidate Apple is probably the incumbent. So we know a lot about how Congressman Apple is going to vote on almost every issue. So it really doesn't even matter if they're a Democrat or a Republican. If candidate Peach is coming in and making legislation that might scare my business, I'm going to donate a lot of money to Congressman Apple. And I don't even need to tell him how to vote. He's just going to separate himself from candidate Peach. And since they're going to compete with each other, he's going to try and keep a distance from him so he can separate himself in the polls. So he's likely to reject almost everything that candidate Peach is trying to accomplish. And therefore, he's going to vote your way without you expressly telling him how to vote at all. And a lot of times, these new upstart candidates, so this is the non-incumbent, right, first-time runner, are coming in and saying a lot of stuff to get attention. That proves to be very scary for a lot of businesses. So we end up with a lot of money pouring into incumbents, but not necessarily to change votes. Just stay the same way you always were, Mr. Apple. That was okay with us. And man, let's do everything we can to keep Mr. Peach out of it. And it's not too hard to find examples of Brubery in the literature. So here's an example right here. So here you have this lobby group or special interest group, right? The Guardian of Small Businesses awards a pewter trophy in public ceremony, sends out press releases to all local media, endorses a legislator for re-election, and guarantees a campaign contribution from its own PAC if he or she is in a close election, if they score 70% or better on a certain list of votes, right? Certain select list of votes. But if they've got a low score, right? Here's the high score. If they've got a low score on that list of votes, that triggers automatically a donation to the challenger. That is called Brubery. And here it kind of meets intimidation because it's a threat that's made public. But again, it doesn't have to be a public thing. Donating to Congressman Apple doesn't always mean an implied or obvious threat to Congressman Peach. And so it's important to realize that we've left out two really big aspects with how money changes legislation: intimidation and Brubery. And if you run down Ayer's list of how disproportionate wealth can be translated into disproportionate political power in three important ways, you'll see that both of them are left off entirely. So it's really important to start thinking about how money actually does change the legislation and not look at all the old crusty accounts that people have been restating for years and years. And I'll talk about this in other videos, but it's pretty interesting to think about how some of these perceptions might have come about. So if you look at the word bribery, you'll realize that it doesn't really have a true one-to-one correlation with many foreign languages. If you translate bribery into French, there is really only one word that works, and that's called corruption. But what's interesting is that corruption doesn't just include bribery, right? If I threaten someone to change legislation, well, that's corruption as well, and that is not bribery. Okay, so in foreign languages, we've even lost sort of the subtlety of what corruption can mean. And of course, in French, you have intimidation, but you don't have sort of this big heading that covers all these various things: bribery, intimidation, and as I now suggest, bribery. So that might be some of the reasons why our perceptions are so bad. And clearly, if you look up corruption in the dictionary, it's pretty lopsided towards this concept that corruption means bribery. So the goal of this video was just to introduce a new way that disproportionate wealth can be translated into disproportionate political power. And that new way is Brubery. And the other big way that no one talks about, Gary Hart, Lessig, and all these others, is intimidation. And both of them might be bigger than bribery itself.